Okay, so let's take a look at communication accommodation theory. Now, I want you to think about this as a theory that really discusses the ways in which we change our own communication behavior to get closer or move away from, as in become more distant with another individual. So, in this way, the theory is really trying to explain that movement, that constant moving closer, moving toward, moving distant, moving away from individuals, and how we use our communication to do that. Okay, so again, an interpersonal theory here. A long time ago, decades ago, this theory was first used to look at interethnic um, interactions, right? So you have a U.S. born student and a Chinese international student. And we are looking for the ways in which they come together and form relationships or other each other and move apart by highlighting differences, for example, between who they are. And again, how they use certain techniques and mechanisms to move toward or away from one another. That's not so much the application of this theory any longer. Now we look at it a lot in terms of generational context, for example, right? A more seasoned individual, perhaps with a millennial or a Gen Z, and of course among other demographics too, right? Any time that you have individuals who come from different demographic spaces, right? How do they create likeness? How do they create otherness? How do they other each other? So here are some of the main key terms for this theory. The first is convergence. And convergence is the way that you yourself adapt your communication behavior to become more like someone. Now, as individuals, we tend to like people who are like us. So, this effort to become more like someone also, therefore, increases affinity, right? So, for example, have you ever been around maybe a group of young adults or teenagers and adjusted the way you speak, maybe by adding more slang phrases or colloquialisms? Um, or, for example, this is not necessarily a good choice, but elderly folks have often talked about the ways in which young people raise their volume, the volume of their voice when speaking to them because of certain stereotypes that perhaps they can't hear, right? So, how do I accommodate you? Communication accommodation by making shifts in my own communication and voice. That's the idea of convergence. Convergence is becoming more alike. Discourse management, then, as another key term, is really thinking about how you're going to, again, manage your discourse, right? Carefully selecting what topics you should discuss and with whom, okay? So, should we talk about sex with our parents? Ooh, I don't know, right? For some of us, we're like, yeah, no big deal. And for others, we're like, absolutely not. What about with elders? Right? Are there certain topics of conversation that are simply taboo due to these demographic differences? Okay, so discourse management is the way in which you alter the content, and convergence is the way in which you adapt or alter your communication behavior. So then divergent becomes the opposite, right? Here are communication strategies that we use to accentuate our differences, right, with other individuals. So here's an example that you can think of. Have you ever had an instructor who you knew was simply using big words just for the case of showing their intelligence or maybe to belittle an audience or to show that they in fact held a particular degree or had an expertise in an area that their audience maybe did not, right? So when we use jargon to showcase intellectual superiority, we are actually engaging in something called divergence. And research suggests that when there's intergenerational interactions or encounters, the divergence tends to be the norm, right? So there are things that we do to make ourselves feel and appear older or younger than other demographics. And convergence then becomes the exception, but not the norm. Now, here's another phrase, and again, I'm not really fond of it, but it's called self handicapping. And this is typically in relation to that intergenerational research, but it is when elderly, for example, invoke their age as a reason for not performing well. Now, we know that that's not just true among the elderly population, right? Sometimes I'll do that in class where I'll be mentioning modern technologies or social medias, and I'll say things like, yeah, for example, take a look at your tweets or your Instagrams or snaps or Reddit, I don't know, whatever you guys are doing, right? And so by saying whatever you guys are doing, I'm self handicapping, I'm showing my age, and invoking the age for the reason why I'm not coming up with relevant examples for my lecture, right? So I hope that makes sense. Now, why do we do this, and how do we do it? Well, one thing is we use convergent strategies for social approval, right? We want people to like us more or less. But then also separately, oops, sorry, Tara, for social identity, right? It's important that we're unique as individuals and different from one another, but we don't want to be so different from everyone that we don't belong or that people don't like us. At least those are some of the assumptions in the theory. So how do we predict what someone will do? Well, again, we can think about cultural differences with individualism or collectivism. How can we predict whether or not somebody will converge or diverge in their communication behaviors? We can also predict what someone might do simply by taking a look at their previous similar interactions with individuals from different demographics. We can start to think about stereotypes and how stereotypes might inform these practices or tell us what we should do, right? Well, if I identify as a woman and you identify as a man, then there are ways in which I'm going to make me, my stories, myself, my experiences different from yours, right? Simply based on gender stereotypes and either breaking those or affirming those. Also, we can understand that there is a certain etiquette that we were socialized with, right? Group norms, how we should behave as a society, and sometimes those give us clues as to reasons why or how someone would or would not converge or diverge. And then also for group affiliation, if you're communicating with someone who's in a group that you desperately want to be a part of, then converging would be the best strategy basically to build solidarity, dependent relationships, trust, affinity, and the like. So how do you know if this is a theory for you? Well, this would be a theory for you if you were interested in your project and taking a look at maybe law enforcement, police, doctors, sports, similar interactions whereby there were fans or that wouldn't be the case with doctors or police, but where you're looking at ways in which, for example, if you were pulled over, that you used your communication behavior to be more or less like the law enforcement, ways in which doctors use their communication to be more or less like their patients or to showcase their expertise, right? I hope that's kind of landing well. Also, if you're looking at any communication patterns in an intergenerational or an intercultural context, this would really be a great communication theory to tie to your project. Again, too, if you're looking at class, gender, or race, especially the intersectionality of any of those, or even sexual orientation, you could take a look at ways in which we accommodate to fit in or be dislike others. And then finally, if you are interested in online communication, especially if you're looking at political forums or political platforms or basically any social media platform, you can take a look at people's comments, the ways that they respond, and whether or not they are using converging or diverging strategies. Again, the reading for this week, Tara, the reading for this week really highlights, gives you way more information and highlights what those different strategies are. So if you're interested in this theory, I definitely encourage you to take a look. Thanks.